They said the night of Scott Swift's surgery unexpectedly reshaped Taylor's bond with Travis Kelce, not only because he saw how fiercely she loved her family, but because he heard Scott's quiet, startling line to him that he had never seen his daughter this at ease with anyone, and because Taylor finally confessed something raw about her father that she had never put into words before. A confession that would crack open years of silence and turn fear into relief, distance into closeness, and effort into grace as dawn crept over St. Luke's in Kansas City on June 18, 2025 at 4:47 a.m. when the waiting room hummed with fluorescent lights and far-off monitors, and Travis folded his long frame into a rigid plastic chair while Taylor paced, tracing the same tight path over and over as if motion could keep the worst from happening. Her steps a frantic metronome for a night that stretched time thin and made every minute feel swollen and sharp, the hours dragging since what was supposed to be routine spiraled into unexpected, more complicated work that left their chests caged by unknowns. And he called to her, telling her gently to sit before she wore through the tiles, reaching to catch her fingers as she passed again. But she said she couldn't stop moving because stillness would break her apart, because her mother needed her steady, because falling into pieces felt one breath away, and she hadn't yet allowed herself to do that. And both of them had already lived the longest. Night of their lives, suspended between updates that never came and questions too frightening to voice. Her father's quintuple bypass stretching far past the plan, the doctors finding more blockage than expected. The timeline blown open, midnight passing, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, until the clock mocked them and she whispered that it was almost 5, and what if something had gone wrong? What if she never got to say what she had held back for years? The thought she couldn't. Complete pressing against her throat until it hurt, and he rose and wrapped her in his arms, feeling her tremble under an oversized Chiefs sweatshirt she had grabbed without thinking, remembering how, in 2 years together, he had seen her stare down executives, carry an arena with a fever, take hits in public with poise, all of that steel and stamina, but never this, never a Taylor stripped of armor and courage, shaking because the person who used to be her lighthouse lay under a surgeon's hands, and he asked quietly what she needed to tell her father, though a part of him already knew this was deeper than a simple goodbye, and she pulled back, tears breaking fresh, and said she wanted to tell him that she forgave him, and the words landed like a bell, startling him because he had never heard her put that sentiment near her dad, who in every story had glowed as supportive, proud, present, the man at the side stage rail, the one beaming in the photos, the advocate and hug. A portrait of a perfect father that he had believed without question until that moment cracked the frame. And she continued, saying she forgave Scott for choosing her career over her childhood, letting the sentence sit in the air with a heaviness that felt like grief. And he said he didn't understand since Scott had always backed her music. And she replied that was the point. He had backed it so hard, he forgot she was a kid who needed a father rather than a manager. And then she began telling him a private story that she had never shared even with friends or with her mother, taking him back to 14 and the move to Nashville, when Scott dove into the business like an architect of a new city, in every meeting, in every negotiation, pushing for leverage and opportunity as if none of them could breathe unless the numbers lined up. And she told him with a voice that sounded smaller that somewhere in those years the bedtime reader and algebra helper vanished, replaced by someone who tracked charts and margins and tours. And she remembered sitting at 15 in a leather and cologne office while grown men parsed percentages, her father arguing the math as though the girl in the chair was an enterprise and not his daughter. And she had wanted him to turn and ask if she was all right, if she was scared, if she wanted to go home and try to fail a pop quiz like a normal sophomore. And Travis felt something split inside because he had always admired how Scott had built scaffolding around her rise. But now he could see the shadow under the success, the price a family pays when a dream becomes the sun everything orbits. And she went on with more urgency, like a cracked dam letting years of stored water through, saying he became a business version of himself, obsessed with next, next, next. And she learned that his attention could be earned, that a smile could be bought with milestones, That if she kept the machine greased and perfect, she could have her dad back. So she stacked achievements like bricks, built towers of approval in the sky. And she told him she kept searching the crowd, every win for the man who used to grin when she learned a chord, chasing that old face in a sea of lenses. And then the door opened, and Andrea came in with bad coffee and a tired smile. And she asked if there was any word, and the answer was the same silence they had been living with. So she sat and moved like someone who had been running on fear-thin fuel. And she tried to talk. About when Taylor was little, about Scott staying up through fevers, taking temperatures, listening to breathing, and Taylor flinched, telling her not to bring up the good right now, because the contrast was unbearable, too sharp, the perfect image cutting into the imperfect reality she had been trying to process all night. And Andrea looked lost, the exhaustion fogging her ability to pick up the emotional current. And Travis realized the forgiveness conversation had never happened with her. Either that Taylor had carried this bruise by herself, not trusting it to light or air until tonight's crisis forced it open. And then Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway in wrinkled scrubs, face set into that trained neutrality that doctors use when news could either fracture or mend a family. And Taylor clamped onto Travis's hand so hard his fingers went numb. And the surgeon said the words they had been praying for, that the operation was successful, that they had found extra blockages, but cleared them, that his heart was strong and he would make a full recovery. And the room exhaled in one ragged sound, like lungs remembering how to work, and Taylor broke into sobs that sounded different, not the brittle, frightened crying of the night, but a rush of relief from some deep well. And he held her while Andrea cried too, and they formed a small cluster of grateful bodies in a fluorescent desert. And when Andrea asked when they could see him, the doctor said soon, after recovery, warning them about the tubes and the monitors, telling them what was normal so they would not be shocked into more fear. And when he left, Taylor said she needed to call Austin, and then she needed to decide what to say to her dad when he woke. And Travis told her she didn't have to figure it out in that instant. But she said she did because the hours of believing she might lose him before she could speak the truth had delivered a realization. That she didn't want to forgive because he had been flawless, or because time had erased the sting, but because he was her father and the old wound wasn't protecting her anymore. It was keeping love at a distance. And he thought he had never been prouder of her than right then, seeing her choose wholeness even when it hurt. And roughly 2 hours later, they were allowed into the room, where the machines made a soft chorus, and Scott blinked himself into focus, groggy and tethered to wires. And Taylor took his hand and said hi, and he called her Superstar and joked that he hoped he hadn't missed anything. And she laughed through her tears and said only the longest night. And he said his had been, too. And then he saw Travis and beckoned him over, calling him son. And Travis drew near uncertainly. And Scott told him he had been watching him with his daughter for 2 years and had never seen her this comfortable, that she had always been guarded, even as a child, keeping pockets of herself hidden like small birds she refused to release, in case they got hurt. But with Travis, he said, pausing to gather breath, with him, she could simply be Taylor, not the icon, not the professional product, just the kid who sang into a hairbrush and dreamed loud. And Travis tried to respond, but Scott asked him to let him finish. And then he confessed his failures, admitting he had gotten so focused on helping her build a career that he had neglected the fathering she needed. And Taylor squeezed his hand and tried to say he didn't have to, but he insisted, looking her in the eyes to say he was sorry for treating her like an asset in meetings, sorry for pressure where comfort should have been, sorry that the apology had taken so long to arrive, and the room thinned to the beep of the monitor and the breath in their chests. And she said she forgave him and loved him and was grateful he was okay. And then came the moment that pivoted Travis's perspective, when Scott turned to him with tears and asked for a promise, to love her for who she is and not what she can deliver, to be the person reminding her that she is enough without trophies. And Travis said he promised, every day. And then, to everyone's surprise, Scott began to laugh, and Andrea asked what was funny, and he said he used to worry about whether Taylor would find someone who could handle the magnitude of her life. And now here was a man who fell for her by listening to her sing sad songs. And Taylor laughed and told him that wasn't exactly how they met. And he said close enough, because the point was that Travis hadn't fallen for the celebrity, But for the woman who writes about feelings and bakes bread when stress climbs the walls,